Welcome, everybody. My name is Cristian Hernandez-Blick, head of program here at Interspecies Internet. And I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the trustees and the organization to our Interspecies Conversations lecture series. Interspecies Conversations is a monthly online talk where leading professors, scientists, researchers, artists, and students share work that contributes to advancing our understanding of communication in other species. And often touches on adjacent topics related to animal cognition, behavior, and welfare. We aim to showcase emerging ideas and discoveries here at Interspecies Conversations and host open discussions where the community can join the conversation with questions and feedback. And if you enjoy this talk or previous lectures in our series, please consider donating to Interspecies Internet to help support our programming, events, and other projects and activities. You can find a donation link on our website, interspecies.io, as well as in the video descriptions on our YouTube channel. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Arik Kershenbaum to our event today. Kershenbaum is a zoologist who specializes in animal vocal communication. He works in the field with wolves and their relatives, as well as gibbons, dolphins, hyraxes, and many other species. His research is focused both on understanding the information content of animal calls and on applying this knowledge to conservation challenges. He is the author of two popular science books, The Zoologist's Guide to the Galaxy and recently Why Animals Talk. So today, Dr. Kershenbaum will present his talk, Why Animals Talk and How Much, actually. Arik will explore how evolutionary pressures shape animal communication, discussing how complex communication arises in species where complex social interactions have an adaptive advantage to communicating larger amounts of information. Hence, rather than attempting to view animal communication as a parallel of human language, it is important to first understand what the adaptive needs of different species are before investigating how much they do or don't have to say. Arik will consider questions about information content and information encoding in animals and propose that the concept of meaning, as we understand it from our own experience, cannot be directly applied to other animals who likely perceive meaning in a very different way to a linguistic species such as ourselves. To illustrate this, Kershenbaum will look at concepts such as Zipf's law and functional reference, as well as consider how our understanding of meaning can be applied in cases where communicative signals are graded, such as in dolphins and wolves. So we're really thrilled to have you here with us today, Arik, and whenever you're ready, take it away.
Okay, let's share sound. Okay, can everyone see and everyone hear? Thumbs up? Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak for this very well-known organization. When I was contacted at first, I think that what I was asked, what I was told was that you are a little skeptical of some of the things we do. I got the impression that what was wanted here was perhaps a little bit of controversy, contradiction. I think that's a little unfair. I'm not really skeptical of the goal of understanding animal communication. Not at all. That's my sort of daily life. But it's true that I think we need to balance our desire to believe that animals can talk like we can with a rigorous scientific understanding of how animals came to communicate the way that they do and why they communicate the way that they do. Certainly there's been a lot of mention in the media in particular about using machine learning, artificial intelligence, potentially to translate animal communication. And all I want to do is to raise a question as to whether there's always something to be translated. In fact, what that might even mean to translate animal communication. So my emphasis as an evolutionary biologist, as a zoologist, is to think more about the animals, think more about animal behavior, rather than just the mathematical or statistical side of the communication. So to this end, I wrote a book, more or less to this end, Why Animals Talk. Note that it's called Why Animals Talk, not what do animals say, but why animals talk. What is the evolutionary background? What is it that has brought different species of animals to communicate in the way that they do? It would be a mistake to think that animals necessarily talk like we do. They've been through a set of evolutionary pressures. They have adaptations that suit them in the niche that they occupy. We've been through our evolutionary pressures, and we have behaviors that suit the niche that we occupy. Communication has to give some kind of adaptive benefit. It has to do something worthwhile for the animal, otherwise it wouldn't evolve. And language in particular, whatever language is, and we'll come to that in a minute, doesn't evolve just for no reason. There's no evolutionary pressure to get to language. It's not an end goal. In fact, I did a podcast recently where I was trying to explain this idea, and the host really got it. He got it absolutely, and said to me, "Oh, so you're saying that like maybe the animals are laughing at us because we're wasting all our time and energy with all this language stuff, and it's really not that useful?" I'm like, that's it. Exactly. Language works for us. That doesn't mean it works for every species. Nonetheless, we all want to think that animals can talk. I want to think that animals can talk. But it's absolutely vital that we don't allow that to interfere with our investigation. Some people believe that all animals speak with a language. Some people believe that none do. Those assumptions are not helpful. We need to investigate. We need to look and see what really is going on. Some animals communicate more, some animals communicate less. So in this talk, I'm going to touch on three things. This is, of course, a huge field, but I'm going to touch on three things. I'm going to ask, firstly, what do we mean by information? What does it mean that animal communication has information in it? I want to talk specifically about a particular kind of animal communication, which is of particular interest to me, is those animal signals that are graded. And I'll come to describe that in a lot more detail. So we're talking about animals like wolves and dolphins. And finally, I want to touch on this very thorny question of reference, or perhaps semantics. What is the nature of the relationship between some form of animal signal and some concept in the real world? Is it possible that animal sounds or symbols or behaviors represent an object in the real world or an idea in the real world? So before I get started on that, we have to do some definitions. I want to define communication, I want to define language, and I want to define information. Some of those are easier than others. Communication's pretty easy, I think. Here's me communicating with a baby wolf. Not verbal communication, but there's clearly communication going on. You can infer for yourself what the wolf thinks about it. I can tell you, though, that for the 100 animal behavior scientists who gathered at this conference, we all turned into sort of squealy little children at the sight of a few wolf cubs. So it's certainly true that we do communicate with other species. But communication can be quite effectively and rigorously defined. And I would define communication as a signal that changes the behavior of the receiver for the benefit of the sender. Now, that might surprise you as a definition of communication. It doesn't sound like a definition of communication. It doesn't say anything about how much information is conveyed. It doesn't say anything about intention. There's no need for the sender to mean anything. And it's, of course, completely agnostic to the medium, sound or vision or anything. But what's nice about this definition of communication is that it doesn't really say what communication is, but it says why communication is. Communication only evolves because one individual, one organism, gets some evolutionary benefit from changing the behavior of another organism. And that is really the bottom line of what communication is. It should be clear from this that essentially all animals communicate. All animals. It's not an unusual phenomenon. It's not a rare phenomenon. It's a ubiquitous phenomenon. Only evolves if the sender gets some benefit from sending a signal. And you may have noticed that it doesn't say anything about whether the receiver benefits or not. Now, much of the time, in many forms of communication, the receiver does benefit. It's a mutually beneficial behavior for the two parties involved. But that gets a little bit more complicated, and particularly when you have social animals that live in a large group with a large number of individuals, there are a lot more complex interactions than there are with animals that are essentially solitary. For one thing, in a group of animals, in any group of animals, essentially, the sender and the receiver are likely to be related to each other. And that means that the sender gets an evolutionary benefit if the receiver benefits as well. So there's sort of this extra push to have a mutualistic interaction. When you have animals that live together in a group, then there are repeated interactions. They're interacting every day, all day. That means that they get to know each other. They get to know whether they can trust each other. And you get a sort of a feedback of more complex communication, more complex cognition, more complex communication, more complex cognition when you have animals interacting in a complex group. And all kinds of strange and interesting games can develop that we won't go into in terms of deception and so on. But this is the kind of way we need to think about how and why animals evolved the way that they are. Because if we just try and think of our own communication and project that onto animals, we're likely to be making a big mistake. Our communication fulfills a certain role for us. That doesn't mean that it fulfills a similar role for other animals. Which brings me neatly on to the definition of language. Now, can be a controversial topic. There are many people who say to me, but all animals communicate, so they all have a language. Maybe, I mean, if you want to make the two words synonymous, you can, I suppose. Doesn't seem very useful. In fact, what humans do in terms of our communication is clearly special. Whatever it is that we do that we call language makes us really quite extraordinary in terms of what we can achieve as a community, as a society, as technology, and so on. So it seems to be useful to have a special word for what it is that we do. What's important, though, is that we mustn't define animals out of what we do. So if you define language in terms of words and sentences or grammar or something like that, there's a risk that you're being so specific that by focusing on what human language is, you're excluding animals who might, after all, have this very remarkable ability. On the other hand, if you say language is just communication, then you've defined all animals in, and then that's not much use either. So my definition of language, you may or may not like it, is this: the potential to convey an unlimited number of concepts. And that's a nice general definition that captures what it is that we humans do that's special, but doesn't really exclude animals. It doesn't say anything about our syntax, our grammar, doesn't even say anything about words and sentences. And again, it says nothing about meaning or about the medium that we're using. And then the third thing I want to define is information. When we say that an animal call or animal signal has information or it has meaning, what does that mean? Can we tie that down? So a couple of ways that people have approached this is to think either about intention, so whether the individual intends to convey a message, and we use the word "I meant to do it," so intention is clearly tied up with meaning. or we use some sort of information theoretic quantitative measure where we look at a signal and say, well, this signal contains so many bits of information, and therefore it has information. But there's a problem. I mean, I'm not 100% convinced that we can even conceive of what meaning might be in another species if that species doesn't have language. So in other words, if that species doesn't have the infinite capacity that we do, then perhaps meaning is a very different phenomenon. Now, people have tried to address this. We've tried to address this. If you are really interested, here's a paper that a student of mine wrote, quite a long and involved paper, but it identifies 3 different aspects of meaning. There are different types of meaning. Meaning seems to have all 3 of these aspects. And if you look at the figure, the green arrows indicate a sort of internal cognitive, what we call the interactant meaning. So this is what the organism is thinking about the information, thinking about the meaning. In the case of the sender, that cognitive process then results in some kind of signal. And then that red arrow indicates your sort of information theoretic element. So the signal itself, what is the amount of meaning in that signal itself? When the receiver receives it, there's also a cognitive process that goes on, another internal interactant element of meaning. So the receiver understands something about the signal. And crucial is that purple arrow, which is the result. Remember, communication has to produce a change in behavior on the part of the receiver, and that's also part of the meaning. The meaning is the effect that it had. So this is the kind of things we need to think about when we try and consider animal information without falling into the trap of just thinking about the sort of information that's in human communication. When we look at animal signals and look at the information in animal signals, we very often confine ourselves to the easy cases, those animals that make a series of distinct calls, separated by silent intervals preferably, easy to analyze, distinct notes, and so on. And you see that in many animals, birds and mammals. You might be tempted to think of those little notes as words. I think that's probably not a great idea. But we can ask ourselves, how do we know whether there's any information in these signals? So I'll illustrate this with one of the animals that I study. This is a rock hyrax. Hopefully you'll be able to hear when I play it. So you can hear that there's a long sequence of multiple different notes, distinct note types. Is there information in it? Well, one of the ways that people have looked at this is to say, okay, the notes, there are a bunch of notes and they have different frequency, there are different probabilities. So some are easier to sing than others. So if we imagine that this animal, this hyrax, was simply rolling dice in its head and saying, okay, what do I sing next? I'll sing a snort next. If that were what were going on, then what we would expect to see is this. We would expect to see no correlation between one note and the next. You would expect that every note that the animal makes is independent of what came before. And that's truly random. And that's not what we see. We see quite clearly that in hyraxes, there's a non-random ordering of the notes. So if you've just sung a snort, you are much more likely to do another snort than to do, say, a squeak. And this is what we call a Markov process, first order Markov process. And it's a form of syntax. There's a form of syntax that they're using. They're not singing randomly, that's for sure. And there's other things that we can look at. So a colleague of mine has done some really fun studies looking at how hyraxes respond to other animals, and they have these sort of really climactic songs when they've got a big audience, and you know, really makes it sound as if these animals are doing something special. There's a lot of information in what they're trying to say. But I'm going to let you into a little secret. Hyraxes are really not that smart. They're really quite dumb, and their behavior is pretty simple. We're pretty certain that these songs that they sing are rather like birdsong. They're male advertising. And this is something that we find across a lot of species. We did a study and we looked at quite a number of species and found that they all have syntax. What's more, they all have syntax that's more complex than a simple Markov process. So of all of these animals that we looked at, RP is this more complex statistical process more complex than Markov series. They all have it. Syntax is everywhere. But does that mean that there's meaning in all of these animals? Are they all saying something interesting? So to illustrate the potential problems with approaches like these, I'm going to mention something that many of you will be familiar with, and that's Zipf's law. Zipf's law is a statistical observation about language in particular, amongst other things. And when you take a particular statistical representation of human languages, you see they all follow this pattern, this very, very clear pattern. Right? They all fall on that nice straight line, that 45-degree line, across humanity. And so that has caused some people to say, well, maybe Zipf's law could be an indicator, a sort of fingerprint of language. Maybe we should be looking for Zipf's law being followed in animals. And if we find it, that means they're using language like ours. They might have a similar pattern to us. But let's dive down and understand exactly what Zipf's law is. So imagine we have a bird that can sing 5 notes, A, B, C, D, and E. So he has a number of options. He could sing mostly one note. So in this case, A, maybe a couple B's thrown in, C, D, and E very rarely. Clearly quite a simple song, quite a boring song. Really, he's not saying anything other than A. Mathematically, there can't be a lot of information in this song. It's a simple song with low information. Alternatively, he could sing all the different notes with roughly equal probability. Now the song is very complex. This is actually the most complex song that he could sing from an entropy perspective. It has maximum entropy, least predictable song, most information possible in it. So you might have thought that since language is so complex, infinitely complex, maybe this is what language should be like, as maximize the amount of information in a signal. But no, we don't find that. We find that language has a very different distribution of, in this case, word probabilities, and a very peculiar distribution. So Zipf's law says that the second most common word in English, say, is half as common as the most common. And the third most common word is a third as common as the most common. And the 10,000th most common word is 1/10,000th as common as the most common word. The only time I've ever used barracudas in anything I've ever written was reproducing this table. But that's word number 10,000. And what we find is that language is absolutely bang in the middle between simplicity and complexity. But this is Zipf's law. But it's been well known for quite a long time that this is nothing more than a trade-off between complexity and simplicity. That in fact you would expect that trade-off between complexity and simplicity. It is optimizing information content while minimizing cognitive burden. You're a very complex signal, you need a bigger brain, more cognitive mechanisms to be able to encode and decode that signal. So you might expect Zipf's law to be followed across a wide range of species, whether or not they have language, just so that they can optimize the balance between complexity and simplicity. And that's indeed what we found, depending on how you measure it. But essentially, there are many species whose behavior in terms of their note probability falls very close within those dotted lines to the sort of values that we see in human language. It's not really a good predictor of whether something is a language or not. Part of the problem that we get into is that there are many different ways that information can exist, even if we just constrain ourselves to sequences of discrete symbols like these, A, B, C, D. And in one of the reviews that we published, we've identified at least six different ways that you could use distinct characters like the notes in a whale song and combine them in different ways to produce meaning, to encode information. And the thing is, scientists have focused almost exclusively on one of them, on the order of those symbols. Why? Probably because what we do, when we think of the ordering of symbols as being where information is, so we've investigated other animals to see if they have an information in the order of their symbols. But there are 5 other ways those animals could encode information using symbols, and they are much less studied. All of them have been, all of them have been identified as ways that animals encode information, but they're much less popular. Even less popular is the thing that really interests me, and that's animals with continuously graded signals. So if you think about wolf howls, these are not a series of discrete sounds. They're a continuous sound, and the pitch is varied up and down, but it doesn't seem to be divided up into elements like words. So that ordering issue, the question of have we got an ordered elements, doesn't seem to be relevant here. And what's really interesting is that wolf howls are actually share a lot in common with dolphin whistles. So they don't sound similar. This is a dolphin whistle, and this is a wolf howl. But you see the spectrograms are actually quite similar. And if you slow that dolphin whistle down about 30 times, sounds like this. Now, this is no coincidence. Wolves and dolphins have evolved a communication channel that suits their evolutionary niche, in particular that suits their environment. Wolves need long-range signals that will go miles across the mountains. Dolphins are communicating underwater in a very specific acoustic environment. And the most effective way to convey information is through this narrow band signal, the thin line on the spectrogram that varies in pitch up and down. That is their evolutionary heritage. Their ancestors evolved this communication form, and now they're stuck with it. Now, the strange thing about these signals, wolf howls and dolphin whistles, is it's remarkably difficult to say just how complex they are. We tried. Here's a selection of wolf howls. Which ones are complex? Which ones are less complex? Is it flat ones are not very complex and ones that go up and down are very complex? Probably. But it's actually quite difficult to measure that. We tried looking at 4 different measures of that complexity, and they actually don't agree with each other very well. So it's almost as if you choose which you want to believe in, which signal you think is more complex, and then choose a metric to go with that. There's no simple way to say, well, this signal is more complex than another one. So where's the information actually? Where is the information in a wolf howl or a dolphin whistle? Well, one thing we do seem to know from one of the studies we did a while ago is that the information does seem to be in the up-down of the signal. So here we took a selection of dolphin whistles for which we knew what the information was. The information was individual identity. We knew these were signature whistles. We knew each whistle, each type of whistle referred to a specific individual. And then by encoding that up-down in a very simple way. So this one here, you can see it goes big rise, and then flat, small rise, small rise, small rise, small rise, big rise, big rise, big drop. That pattern is characteristic of that particular signature whistle. And in fact, if you encode the signature whistles using a very simple system like that, it very reliably recovers the individual identity in that whistle. So clearly the information is in the way that the whistle goes up and down. But there's a problem with these continuously varied signals, which is that here you see a selection of signature whistles from the same animal, same individual. If you overlay them on each other, they look pretty much continuous. Right? They vary almost continuously from one end of their spectrum to the other. On the right there, you see the signals that have been through a dynamic time warping process to try and get them to conform, and they conform pretty well. They're all the same whistle, but look how varied they are. And that does imply that these kinds of continuously variable graded signals just aren't a really good candidate for encoding a lot of information. In the case of wolves and dolphins, they may have a lot of communicative need, but they've been constrained by their phylogenetic history. They've been constrained by their communication channel to use a signal that's simply not very reliable for high information content. You see, if I have two digital sequences, if I have two Hyrax sequences, for instance, they're either identical or they're not. And the information can be in whether they're identical or not. Two analog signals can't be identical. No two dolphin whistles are identical. So how do you ensure that you get the right message at the other end? And that takes us to the last point I wanted to make about reference. How do we know what the signal means? So here's another example of some wolf communication. So what does it mean? What do we think the wolves are saying? It's not easy to tell. Wolves are not the easiest animals to study in the wild, it's true. But we're pretty sure that there are at least 4 different messages in wolf howls. Wolf howls can be territorial. So between two packs, advertising territory. They can be cohesion calls. So the individuals in the group get dispersed. They want to know where each other is, come back together. You also get dispersing individuals who want to find a mate, join another pack, create another pack. And then there's the social element. So wolves will often howl just for the fun of it. They just want to, there's a kind of a benefit to showing that the whole pack is together and everyone is okay, and they just enjoy howling. How do we tell the difference, if there is one, between those 4 meanings? So one of the things that we can do, one of the things that we do is we record howls and we use all kinds of technological tricks to find out where the animals are. So in this case, we triangulate the position of the animals from the sounds that they make. And if you can hear, there's one very faint wolf and then some louder ones. And we can see from the position that there's a group of animals and one individual far away. So maybe this is a cohesion call. Maybe they're saying to each other, come back home, or where are you? I can't see anyone. We're over here. This example, however, is between 2 groups of animals. There are multiple individuals at each location. And this is more clearly an interaction between 2 packs, a territorial interaction. These ones are easy to identify. We've got quite a few good recordings of those sorts of interactions. Now, if we go back to how we defined communication, we could try to correlate between the sound and the response. We know that the sender would like to influence the behavior of the receiver, in this case, perhaps to make a call, and that the receiver goes away. And that's traditionally how people have looked at inferring referential meaning in animal signals, trying to correlate behavior to the sound itself. But particularly in this case, particularly with the wolves, we do have a bit of a problem, which is that the signals themselves are constrained by the ecology. A complex signal, by definition, cannot be as robust as a simple signal. If we've got 4 things to say, we can say them very robustly. If we have more to say, then the robustness of that signal declines. And as you can hear from those recordings, when a wolf is far away, it's pretty difficult to hear what sort of sounds they're making. So if we have multiple howl types, we could postulate they mean different things, but that's not very robust. Small differences between different howls are likely to get lost in the propagation of the signal. So although different types of howls could mean different things, it seems unlikely that there's a one-to-one correlation between a howl type and a particular meaning. Now, if we're talking about translation, if you're talking about translating animal calls, that puts us in a bit of a difficult situation. Because if you want to translate animal calls, what you really want is something like this: one call, one meaning. And if that's not the case, then it's questionable what translation even means, or if it's possible. We're used to thinking about words. We're used to thinking about a word with a meaning. Translating from Vietnamese to English is looking at what the word in Vietnamese is and finding the equivalent English word. That's translation. But what if there's no words? What if there's no one-to-one correlation between a type of sound and a particular meaning? Then translation seems to take on a different form. It means something else. Can it mean anything at all? Animals do communicate. They do communicate information. So how do they do it? Well, one of the things that seems to be what's going on with animals is emotion, is that motifs convey emotion, which is something we're quite used to, actually. This is not something that's alien to us at all. I mean, consider this. Compared to this. So the emotional effect, the idea that's being conveyed seems quite clear to us, if we're used to Western music at least. But there's no one meaning. There's no one word that you could use to translate either of those pieces of music. And I think this is a lot more of what's going on in animals. So I caution the concept of translation where signals need to be robust and therefore perhaps not as specific as we're used to. Anyway, before I wrap up, there's one more thing that I'd like to mention. If we consider both the information potential of a signal and the information requirements of the animals, we can do a graph like this. So birds, for instance, a lot of songbirds in particular, have very, very, very complex signals. There's a very large information potential. You can get a lot of information into a songbird song. But they probably don't use that information. In fact, we're pretty sure that in most songbirds anyway, the message, the complexity of the message is the message, right? They're just saying, look what a complex song I can sing. It's worth coming to mate with me. That's the entirety of their message. So in songbirds, at least, they have high information potential, but a low information requirement. Wolves and dolphins in particular, on the other hand, clearly have a high information requirement. They live in complex communities, complex societies. They have a lot of social interaction, but their evolutionary background has constrained them to have a low information potential in their calls. So then the question is, how did we get to where we are with a high information potential and a high information requirement? Well, there's really two possibilities. Either we evolved through a state of having high information potential, and we became more and more social and grew our social our ability to fill that information potential with true information. That's like the parrot path. Or we evolved from animals that had a high information requirement and then acquired greater information potential. And we kind of think that that's actually what happened. We kind of think that it was the social requirements that drove increased communicative complexity, but we don't know. Whatever it is, it would seem that language is up there somewhere in the top right corner. You need that large information requirement, you need the large information potential. So just to summarize what I've said, talked about the nature of information. I've got this idea that information has many different facets, all of which are fundamental elements of what information is. Ordering, which we're very used to ordering elements to give information, that's not the only way. Plenty of animals use other methods. So if we're looking at information in animal signals, we need to look at all of those different ways of encoding information. And things like Zipf's law, syntax are common behaviors, common properties of animal communication because they optimize whatever it is the animals need to optimize. They're not indicators of some kind of intentional communication. When we think about those animals with graded signals, they often arise because of environmental evolutionary constraints, the kind of environment in which the animal needs to communicate. And they're just not very good for encoding large amounts of information. That doesn't mean they don't. Okay, that doesn't mean that. Firstly, it doesn't mean that dolphins don't have a lot of information in their whistles. Actually, dolphins communicate using other channels as well as whistles. But so there's lots of different ways you can get around it. But those graded signals themselves are probably not a veritable mine of information. And finally, when we think of semantics, we think of reference. To expect animals to have words is unreasonably projecting our own ideas about communication onto animals that have very different requirements. You don't need words and sentences to have meaning, but that meaning can be quite fuzzy. It could be conveying emotional ideas. It could be motifs. And never forget that complexity and robustness have to be traded off against each other. That's always something that we need to worry about. If you ever want to know what an animal is saying, think about what it needs to say. What's adaptively advantageous for it to say. That'll probably be what it's saying. So that is my non-controversial take on how we look at animal communication. I want to thank my research group, of course, Dr. Dassow, Dr. Guttridge, Dr. Smith, wonderful collaborators. You can read more about us here. And I have the book both in the UK and the USA. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing that talk with us, Arik. Absolutely fascinating. A lot of information to chew on. Um, at this point, yeah, as we always do, we're going to pivot to open discussion, comments, and questions from the audience. So, as a reminder, you can use the chat function to post questions or add to the discussion using the chat icon at the bottom of the screen, or if you'd like to speak on the call, use the react icon and the raise hand function so we know who to call on. And please feel free to introduce yourself and say something about your background before sharing your thoughts if you'd like. I see Ralph or Jeff. I didn't catch who had their hand up first. I think Ralph maybe, but
Okay, so I come from a background in philosophy, particularly environmental philosophy and animal ethics. Um, Lately, I've gotten interested in branching out to other organisms, by which I mean plants. And I was wondering, I had an interesting scenario to bring up regarding botanical beings. So some botanists indicate that certain species of plant um, signal each other, and there seems to be a passage of information between them, but there's no intention. So how do we make sense of that on your set of parameters and definitions?
Well, yeah, well, but that's actually quite easy to do because communication doesn't require intention. Um,
Okay.
from the perspective of the definition that I gave, yeah, if one plant can increase its fitness by influencing another plant or indeed an animal, as does happen, using by sending a signal, then that is communication. The obvious example, of course, being flowers. Um, colored flower to attract pollinators is a clear case of a plant giving a signal to an animal to increase the fitness of the plant. So there's no problem with that at all. And the lovely thing about not touching the intention topic is that it really does apply to all animals. You don't have to get into an argument, are bees conscious, are bees not conscious? Jellyfish can communicate, even though we're pretty sure they have no intention or consciousness. But yeah, it totally applies to
Hmm.
plants as well. Now, okay, as a zoologist, I have a bias towards animals. Yes, it's true. Um, and I do think there is a qualitative difference between animals and plants, but it's not in communication per se. The real difference, and this does affect communication nonetheless, is that because animals move, they have this sort of time critical element to their niche. So animals need to make decisions quickly in a way that plants don't, um, and by and large, and that really does shape the nature of communication in many ways. But to say that plants communicate, 100% agree.
Jeff, you want to go for it?
You bet. Thanks, Arik. Brilliant. And thanks for the rigor. Awesome. And this is obviously too small of a forum to talk about all these topics, but here I go. So, regarding unlimited concepts, that sounds a lot like recursion to me or something along those categories. I'll let you define what you mean by unlimited concepts, but I wasn't totally sure. So, I noticed you didn't define the word or concept or emotion or intention. And of course, this would take us a decade, right? So I get it. That's not a criticism at all. But ultimately, I'm guessing that we might agree that at least a word could be abstractly defined as some type of physical medium, sound, vision, gesture, olfaction, that results in, and notice I didn't say transmits, repeated behavioral response. And with the word repeated, I'm leaning towards that is what a concept or meaning is because it's repeated. So here are my three questions. Can a Homo sapien transmit information via communication using language in one word or morpheme or semantic unit? Pick your poison. That's the first question. The second is, has any non-human transmitted information via communication using more than one sound, gesture, whatever word in sequence? And then lastly, why do humans have limits to their ability to do linguistic embeddings or recursion? Because we've never actually produced unlimited numbers of concepts. And does that not suggest we too have information processing limits? That's it.
Okay, yeah. I should have written them down, but I'll do what I can. So first of all, about this unlimited thing. Start with the last one first. Yeah, it's I never said that humans evolved language because of the unlimited ability. In fact, it's absolutely clear that we didn't, because our ancestors never needed to build spaceships and computers and things like that. And whatever happened that drove the evolution of language, those first users of language were not conveying infinite concepts. No, that's a byproduct. And I think this is the sort of, Irene can talk to this more, but there are many species. Well, there are species, not many. There are a number of species that can understand these concepts, but they're not using it in the wild. These concepts of concepts like language. So parrots, chimpanzees, perhaps can learn bits and pieces of language. I don't think there's any real doubt about that. Recursion is really, it talks about recursion and elements and combine. Do any animals combine more than one element? Yes, is the answer. There certainly are, but I don't know. I'd go back to what I said before. Why are we restricting ourselves to thinking about the ordering of elements to encode information? That is what we do. Agreed. That doesn't mean that has to be what animals do. Now, some will, as you say. There are examples of animals that there are primates. We've seen it in mongooses. Combination of elements to make new meanings. But that's not the only way. There are many different ways of encoding meaning. So
don't get hung up on that one. That's
okay.
Not where I'm. It's you defined language as unlimited number of concepts, and I'm challenging that no one's proven that humans unlimited concepts, and that there's plenty of evidence even in neurology that the linguistic system of a human is limited in its ability to do recursion. But I wasn't sure if you were. I'm not. Yeah.
Okay. No, fair enough. And I take your point. I don't know the answer. I mean, I've got my ideas, but I suspect that I didn't spend all that long on defining language for a very good reason. If you notice, I didn't actually talk about language very much in this talk. I think that if we define language as what humans do, that is almost good enough. What I really want to know is, can whales, dolphins, chimpanzees, grey parrots do what we do, communicate like we do? Maybe that's a better way of doing it. But I think we should move on, because we could get hung up on the definition of language for a very long time.
Thanks.
I think Sarah's next.
Hi, Arik, Dr. Kershenbaum. I'm actually a freelance journalist for KLW Public Media, and I'm actually doing a story on a podcast episode for Philosophy Talk called "Why Are Humans So Special?" So I want to take it down one notch from that, just for the average listener. If languages, my question is, it may be a different version of the previous. If language is unique to humans, and if we don't have to say that animals have language and words, how should we think of humans as special? What can we say that is exceptional or different about humans, if anything? And how have your studies affected how you think about this, especially in the context of conservation and how we treat animals?
Sure. So I do think humans are special, but I didn't say that humans are unique. Right. There's a big difference. I mean, I think it's clearly the case that what we do is special, right? We go to the moon. It's special. Now, are we unique? Here, the problem is, I think what you said was why should we think, or why do we think, or why are we? The crucial thing is not to assume one way or the other. not to assume either that we are unique, that no other animals do what we or have the ability to do what we can do, or that lots of animals do, and you know, we want to believe our dog can understand us, therefore we say our dog can understand us. We've got to be careful of those two extremes. No, I don't think it's obvious at all that animals can't have language. I think the evidence at the moment is that there aren't any other species that can communicate in as complex a way as we do. But you know, this is science. This is a rapidly developing and difficult field. It could be one way, it could be the other. The important thing is not to make assumptions.
Okay, thank you. But can you get to the second part of my question? What are the implications of all this for conservation and the way we treat animals?
I work on conservation a lot. I work with animals a lot. I work with animals in the wild. I can tell you, I do not need to believe that animals have a language to want to conserve them and protect them. That's simply not. It just doesn't. No, I'm sorry. I don't buy that one. There are many reasons to assign rights to animals apart from having language.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hish.
Sorry, I had my mic off. Hi, I'm Tish Shute, and I'm currently working on a project to build a simulator for AI scientists of all ages to explore new models of intelligence on a continuum of natural and artificial intelligence. And I was highly motivated to do this I just want to thank you for your talk, because so many things you said about communication are behind my motivation in this project, where I think we're sort of, you know, we've got the whole world gung-ho on artificial intelligence without even a definition of intelligence. And I've been very inspired by some of the work of Mike Levin and on the lower levels of the sort of basal cognition. And I just wondered, you know, if you had, you know, thought about any of this work that's now been done by people like Mike Levin. He's from Tufts in the US, where I'm from. And you know, because this is really, with this sort of I don't know, I'm just sort of a little tired of the dialogue of separating artificial from natural intelligence. I think it's a huge mistake. We're on a continuum. I'm also a little tired of the sort of, you know, the fact that all the focus is on a sort of, I mean, a very mythological idea of intelligence. You know, very much like, you know, the idea of uploading brains to computers, and I don't know if you've touched base with any of this work on basal cognition and really looking at the, you know, diverse, a bit like you're talking, diverse forms of communication, but this is in the frame of diverse forms of cognition from the sort of cell level up in a sort of hierarchy of intelligence that goes all the, you know, I mean, how do animals and ourselves evolve from cells to these amazing beings? I don't know if that's sort of my question, is just that, are you familiar with the work on diverse forms of cognition, basal cognition? Because it seems very, I mean, it's not directly related, but the frame of your formalisms on community is so good, and it's a lot the way I think about, you know, how we should think about intelligence. I mean, we sort of got to move on from the Turing test of just this some idea we have of human intelligence to a more diverse frame.
Yeah, and so obviously I'm certainly not going to get into a definition of intelligence. Not doing very well with defining language, so I'm not going to get into defining intelligence. But what I will say is that when we talk about communication, in particular, language and so on, the key thing is a very particular kind of intelligence. So not problem-solving intelligence, it's that social intelligence. Yes. What is driving complex communication is social intelligence. And this is, you know, it's a theory, but the prevailing theory is that our ancestors lived in extremely socially complex societies. They evolved a kind of social intelligence that was really quite quite particular, and we see quite a lot of that in primate, particularly in apes today. With when they live in complex social groups, complex interactions, complex cognition, and the language, the complex communication is built on top of that. So it's not that it's not that one or the other. It's this sort of them building together, which is very different from the kind of intelligence that you think of. Problem solving, IQ, puzzle boxes, all those kinds of things. It's the social intelligence that's kind of neglected, and that's what's driving complex communication, I think.
Yes, and that's exactly actually from the frame of diverse forms of cognition. The core is that the idea that all intelligence is collective intelligence, but I'm looking down the stack of intelligence inspired by Mike Levin, and it's these collective intelligences of sort of an agentic model he builds. But yeah, it's a wonderful talk. I've just loved this talk because I haven't been as focused on some of the things that the communication level, just because I'm very interested in the lower end of the stack. So it's wonderful work. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Mary.
Yeah,
Hi.
I'm Mary Ann Simons, and I have my background's in behavioral ecology, but my graduate work was all in interspecies consciousness and psychology, and I guess I'm always the one that's been applying it for 40 years. So having taught interspecies communication to veterinarians and horse trainers, studying wild horses for 30 years in the field, I have found that, and not just wild horses, but other wildlife species, that living in the field and using the languages, and I was so happy to hear you say the social intelligence, because I just finished a book on A Horse by Nature with the 5 channels of communication. And it really points out that emotional intelligence is what most social species strive for. They don't need language. I mean, there has to be a motivation for communicating in vocalization, but that the dominant communication was eye contact, touch. If a horse, whether it's out in the field or it's in a barn, if it wants to socialize with another horse, there's a stop, there's a look, there's a head nod, there's a nose bump, and then they go in for buddy scratching. There is no vocalization. It's a request for social reinforcement. So a couple of things I thought you really hit on that I think we need more exploration is to turn the dial from looking at intelligence and language and what I call a human-centric approach, and look at it more from a nature or animal-centric approach that says, what is the priorities for that animal? What is the motivation that they would even want to use communication, and in what channel would they want to use it? So that I'm hoping more people will get and explore. I have lots and lots of experience with applying the techniques, and then the proof's in the pudding. If you teach someone how to lower their brain waves and use eye contact and the same calming signals that you'd use with people or horses, and the horse relaxes and they go out and they win, that's validation. And that's an interspecies, but it is from copying how the horse does it with another horse to engage that social connection. So I'd love to see more what your thoughts are on expanding communication into other channels of communication.
Yeah, and it's a really, really good question, and you're absolutely right that that the acoustic channel is just one, and in many ways it's not even the most important one, right? And olfaction is the oldest communication channel, but there is something going on here, and I'm not entirely I'm not entirely sorted with myself of exactly what's going on evolutionarily, but there does seem to be a particular place for sound, and that is because sound goes round things. And so if you want to communicate any distance at all, really, in a slightly cluttered environment, sound's the way to do it. You can't see around a tree, and somehow that has led sound, as you say in your comment. Fine for warnings. Warning is a clear case where sound is the best way to signal a warning. But for some reasons, sound has become the sort of the modality of choice for large information content. Now, there's some good reasons for that, right? Sound can encode more information than other channels because we have this very simple mechanism for deconvoluting the frequencies in sound. It's actually really simple to do a spectrum analysis on sound using our cochlea. It's a clever mechanism. It's purely mechanical, and it worked great. So sound has a few characteristics which make it a really rich information channel. Vision is also a rich information channel, but again, it's blocked by any tree. So there's something going on there that has led sound to be if you like, the dominant communication channel for high information content. But yeah, absolutely, it's certainly only one of them, and the one that's not investigated nearly enough is electric signals. They really have they have everything that's needed to be a really rich information channel, but there's only a handful of species that use them, so it's not really been researched enough.
Well, and to your
Oh,
point,
sorry.
I don't think we have any of this research done because the horse world is in a place where you don't see a crossover between academic and the industry. But if you take a mare who's has a senior status in a barn, and you walk her down the barn aisle, every single horse will whinny, will talk in the same, even though their voices sound different, in the same bandwidth. It's always that short call because they can't see each other. They're dark, their stall doors are there, but there is a definite emotional, I see you, where are you going? And the same when that horse comes back. Another horse walks up and down, there's no communication whatsoever. So, I mean, we can ascertain it's a greeting call, and it's a respectful greeting call that we see you, come back. And then when they come back, it's hi, we see you. And maybe that's all the meaning that's needed, just recognition.
Agreed. Yeah, I think I think that certainly makes a lot of sense. That certainly makes a lot of sense. Sue. You're on mute. You're still muted.
Sorry. Thank you very much for your talk and kind of your clear background. I've been trying to wrestle a bit myself, and it's not easy to give a clear background. But I will say that I was well trained in all of the things that you say, and I was taught to believe that animals could not really talk and that there would be something different between what they did and what we did. And of course, I spent quite a bit of time trying to understand if they could learn to do what we did, and a lot of time rearing human children as well, and asking if they could talk at a time that they can't talk, or at least we can't understand what they're saying. They do believe that they talk, and they spend a long time comprehending what we say before they begin to talk, which people didn't used to understand at all, and I'm not sure that that is really taken into consideration. But my question is twofold. One, if we define language as what humans do, then that's going to sort of separate us from ever understanding if animals do anything like we do, particularly if the whole field accepts that definition, which it has done for quite some time, and the whole field of linguistics has also accepted that definition. So they've sort of parted themselves off, and I was kind of left in between. And I wanted to give an example of when I realized that I was kind of in a place in between, and have you address it, because you seem to be able to clearly define things, but you also know the limits of giving a definition, and you're very careful as you do that, which I respect. And I think we all ought to take that as an example. But I had spent quite a lot of time trying to teach a human language, and then I realized that I didn't actually need to teach it, that the bonobos I had who had come from a bonobo who had been raised in the wild up until adolescence were just picking up language. And I happened to be using an English language when I talked to them, and I happened to be using a keyboard, but they were learning without me having to teach it. And they were also learning something from this female named Matata, who had come in as an adolescent. And most apes come into captivity as babies, and they're kind of reared as wild children in many cases, not intentionally, but there aren't really mothers around, and there certainly aren't wild groups around. And so I saw that this young bonobo that I was working with was communicating with his mother, who was completely out of his sight in a different room. And I first saw that when he was about 2, and he went up really, really high to look out of a window in a certain direction. He had to climb up kind of a corner in the wall to look out. And I thought, well, why would he do that? And then I realized his mother was talking, and I went to where she was, and she was looking away far in the woods in a different direction. And I saw there was a human there far away on a telephone pole. It was like a human in a tree. And I thought, that seems like some kind of linguistic thing to me, what's going on there. But then when I went to the wild, to the Congo, was when I really began to ask the question more deeply, because I took a bunch of tapes to study the vocal communication. Obviously, the bonobos in the wild were not going to be using keyboards. So I was going to study vocal communication. And the first day I was there, just by chance, I didn't know what I was doing. I was completely dependent on the trackers. Otherwise, I'd have been lost in the forest. I had been in a forest a lot with bonobos, but this was very different. And the sounds were extremely different. I had only been exposed to maybe 5 to 7 bonobos at a time. Suddenly, at least 400, if not more, bonobos were coming together and were around me, and they were coming together from different groups, and they were just vocalizing back and forth. And I was so excited, and I tried to record it all on my tape recorder, and it went on for about 4 hours. So I used up all the tape in one time that I had brought, and these bonobos vocalized back and forth as they came together, and males literally rained down out of the trees. They would leap out of 250-foot trees and grabbing branches like that as they went down, vocalizing back and forth to each other. I don't know if you would label that as a display or not. That's just what they did as the groups came together. And after the males did that, which was for maybe half an hour, the females began to vocalize and come closer together, and then all the groups began to come closer and closer together, and then they all began to share food. The best way I could say it was like a party in the trees. And of course there was emotional feeling, and of course that came across like it does in a wolf or a dolphin or another human can give that same whining or whatever you want to call it. But there was a lot more going on, and they were exchanging food. And how could they do this for 3 or 4 hours and stay in such an excited state if they weren't like at a human party and exchanging information about where they were, what they did in the past, where they were going next, all this kind of thing that sounded language-like? I mean, in the context, it seemed language-like to me. So why would we assume why would we the first assumption be that it isn't just because they're an animal? Doesn't that sort of knock us out from even looking at that, even though it's hard? If we go to a human party in another language, we can't understand what the people are saying, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with everything you said. And I think that when I said, how about, it was just a suggestion, it's not, it's a suggestion. How about saying that language is what humans do? I mean, in the most general sense, what humans do in the most general sense, we communicate a lot of information. In no way am I suggesting that we define animals out of language. That for sure. That's not what I mean, and I don't think that's the right thing to do. As far as the sort of social interactions in the wild go, absolutely. We've got to look and see what the animals do in the wild, and it's difficult. Yeah, I know it's not easy to go through the jungle and find the find the animals. But what you describe is perfect. It really is a perfect example of what we see in a lot of very social animals, and not just mammals, right? But parrots. That if you watch a flock of monk parakeets or something like that, they're constantly interacting, largely about food availability. There is a lot going on in those social species when they live in a group. There's always communication going on, and it is difficult to unpick, but that's our job. That's absolutely what we've got to do. I agree. You look at it and you say, this is certainly communication. Is it language? Well, that depends to a large extent on how much information there is, I think.
Well, I thank you for both
sorry.
those answers. I thank you for both those answers. I think that is the right perspective to take.
So first of all, thank you so much, Arik, for this very interesting talk. I'm a linguist, so I'm really not trained in anything biology or anything of the sort. But I do have, one question and some side comments on top of that. So my question would be, would you think, of course, me being a linguist, my question would be, do you think that linguistics might be useful for the study of animal communication? The reason why I'm saying this, while listening to your talk, at some point you said something that reminded me of a particular theoretical concept and framework that we also do use in linguistics. So me personally, I don't know if anybody here is a linguist or has heard about this particular framework, but I'm both a historical linguist and sort of training in typology. And one of the theoretical frameworks that we have, that I personally have adopted in typology, is this so-called radical construction grammar. And from this perspective, what people think from a radical construction grammar viewpoint is that there is a link between what we call form and what we call as function. Now, the reason why I'm saying this, at some point you said that it can be possible to assess the reference through correlation, which means correlating behavior to sound, which is pretty much also what we do with human languages. At some point you said, well, with languages we can look up for the translation of a given word, as you said in your example, from English to Vietnamese. As a matter of fact, this is not always the case, not even for human language, because if you think of something which might sound trivial to each and every one of us, such as an adjective in English, which resembles more or less a noun, is not the same thing in Japanese. In Japanese, it's actually closer to the category of verb rather than to category of noun. So from this perspective, would you think that linguistics might, at least some theoretical linguistic frameworks might actually be useful also for the study of animal communication?
I think that these ideas in formal linguistics are extremely useful in helping us understand human language. They can be problematic when trying to apply them to animal communication if they are assuming certain aspects of our language as if they also apply to animals. Even, for instance, as I was saying, words and sentences. You're not going to get very far as a linguist without words and sentences. But if animals don't do that, then there's a problem with theory. Where linguistic theory really can help is thinking with that transition from non-language to language in the human lineage, which we still don't understand how that happened. Okay, our ancestors, who were presumably somewhat chimpanzee-like, more or less, we think, 6 million years ago, didn't have a language, and then at some point their descendants did have a language. How did that happen? What were and this is not my field, but there are loads of people who think about this from the linguistics perspective, from the psychological perspective, neurological perspective, and so on. How much is copying involved? How much a very complex series of events, but it's that series of events that generated all the complexity you're talking about. And I don't think, and some people may disagree with me, but I don't think that those kinds of structures exist in any other species. As we see in nouns, for instance, nouns, verbs, adjectives. I'm highly skeptical that that's the case for a lot of the reasons that I spoke about. So I think linguistics particularly helps in understanding how language evolved. How it applies to non-linguistic animals is less clear. However, let me qualify that. When you come to something like Alex the parrot or Sue's bonobos, who have demonstrated an ability to learn a human language, then I think that there's some serious questions for linguists about what elements of the language have they actually learned? What elements of the language do they actually perceive? And that's where I think it can be extremely important. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're nearing the end of our time, I think. I was hoping maybe I could squeeze in a really quick question. It's sort of a simple one, maybe given my lack of experience in this area, but I'm interested in the idea that you've talked about increases in the complexity of communication systems are driven by increases in social complexity. And that there's this sort of like reinforcing evolutionary loop there, this like story of that. But and you've spoken to different ways about how you quantify communicative complexity, but I'm wondering sort of how does one measure something like social intelligence or complexity of social interactions? How do you define and measure something like that? How do you quantify it? And is there a way to study the causal link between those two phenomena? Or is it just sort of like an evolutionary story and it's not quite possible to test or something?
Well, evolution, there are a lot of evolutionary stories because, of course, we're looking at a snapshot. It's very, very difficult to do evolutionary cause and effect when we're looking at one point in time, particularly when there aren't a huge number of examples around. But can you quantify it? Yeah, I think you had Kat came on and gave a talk a while ago, right? Kat Habaita. That's sort of I'll defer to her field when working with communities of highly social animals like chimps in the wild, then you look at social interactions and you look at the social network and you ask things about triads. Do they understand that my enemy's enemy is my friend, for instance? That's the sort of crucial thing, and the thing that underpins all of this, interestingly, is sense of self and other. That would seem to be the big innovation in socially complex species, because if you don't have a sense that your information is different from someone else's information, then it's very difficult to see how language per se can really evolve. But that really is, you said it was a small question, it's a huge question. Right? It's like it's a pretty big field.
Right. Okay, yes. So Arik, thanks again for joining us and sharing some of your incredible work and some of these ideas in your new book, Why Animals Talk, The New Science of Animal Communication, which is out now through Penguin Random House. Go pick it up for yourself. Get it as a gift for a loved one. You can download the audiobook anyway, get your hands on it. And if you'd like to stay up to date with Dr. Kershenbaum's work, I'm just going to post some links to his website and social channels in the chat right now. So there are a lot of questions still in the comment section that I think we just don't have the time to get around to, but thank you so much to the Interspecies Internet community for coming out. We're always so happy to see this interest and engagement with our programming. And on that note, if you'd like to learn more about our organization or stay up to date with events, projects, and other activities, or connect with a community of researchers and enthusiasts, please follow us on social media or visit our YouTube channel, join our Slack conversation, or subscribe to our newsletter. So once more, on behalf of Interspecies Internet, the trustees, and the community, thank you so much, Arik, for your generosity and your time. Thank you, everyone in attendance, and please join us next month for another Interspecies Conversation talk.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.